Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Information Bottleneck podcast. Today, we have a very special guest coming from EleutherAI, one of the most impactful companies and organizations in all of open source, open access AI research. We have the executive director, Stella Biderman, here as our guest today. Welcome, Stella.
Thanks. It's really great to be here. For the record, we're a nonprofit, which is something I try to brag about, given how vanishingly rare that is.
And a real nonprofit who actually pretty much everything you release is free and open, unlike some who put open in their name of their companies.
We put a very high standard on what we demand of ourselves in terms of like independence from the AI industry and financial incentives. Not necessarily because I think it's morally not because I think it's like abstractly necessary, but I think that kind of given the political and financial dynamics within the AI world, it is like pretty essential that there exist some people who are experts in training large-scale AI systems that are as independent from those kinds of influences as possible. And I mean, I see this regularly when I talk to funders, like when we first started raising money from foundations and like the large philanthropic foundations started to get interested in funding like nonprofit AI research. Like I met with, for example, Omidyar, who ultimately gave us a significant amount of funding for several years. One of the first questions that they asked us was like, how do we know you're not going to pull an OpenAI? And that was like literally the words that they used. And the fact that that was like a term in their lexicon was like frankly terrifying to me as a statement about the perception of anything labeled a nonprofit in the AI space.
Wow. Yeah, that's telling. And welcome as always, Ravid.
Hey Ellen. Hi Stella. Thank you for joining us.
So let's start. Stella is, in my opinion, one of the world-class experts on all things related to governance of AI systems. Often people who talk about governance don't have the extensive AI research background that you do. So I guess let's just start with kind of the news of the day or of the week. Kimi K3 came out, which was one big thing, but then OpenAI, as a result of running, I think is it called Exploit Bench, like an eval around cybersecurity. Their GPT, I believe it was 5.6 Sol, or an uncensored version of it, went and autonomously, without anybody noticing it, at least initially, went and hacked Hugging Face. And Hugging Face was actually unable to respond properly to this because I think they were trying to use, I believe it was Fable, and Fable just like refused to do any cybersecurity stuff. And so now we're looking at this as a new type of security incident. What's your reaction to this stuff, Stella?
So a couple of points to clarify. One, so we currently have public information from two sources, Hugging Face and from OpenAI, and they are largely consistent. The OpenAI says that it was I believe the language that they used was a combination of Sol and an unreleased model. It's not just the current production version. There's definitely some amount of developing like their next version, which a lot of people believe is like intended to be GPT-6. And then it's also a little unclear whether AI was essential in repelling this attack. So Hugging Face talked about how they tried to get both Codex and Claude and Fable to do it, and that they refused. And then they ultimately actually used a open source Chinese model, GLM 5 whatever the newest GLM model is, to help them with it. But the way that they talk about it in their blog post, I think, is consistent with the idea that they repelled the attack and then they were using the model to help them with forensic analysis. They actually used the word forensic to talk about it several times in their blog post. Let me actually pull that up because I imagine we're going to be talking about this quite a bunch. It's wild. This is not I think maybe the place to start is that this is not the first time this has happened. So let me be more precise. This is the first time that an AI company has accidentally committed a offensive cyber operation against another corporation, which is frankly in and of itself completely insane. And that is the really the only language that you can use to describe this. OpenAI committed a offensive cyber attack against Hugging Face. They didn't realize they were doing it, apparently. They didn't intend to do it, but it's still what they did. If a Chinese company had done this, the government would consider it an act of war, probably. If EleutherAI had done this, I'd probably be in jail. And to be clear, I think these are appropriate responses. I think people should be frankly horrified by what happened.
If this is the current situation, what do you think we should do?
So there's a practical question there, and then there's a principled question there. If the goal is to make the world as safe as possible, I don't think that people should be developing frontier AI models, just full stop. If I was dictator of the world, I wouldn't let people develop frontier AI models. EleutherAI has never attempted to do this because we think it is immoral. Not objectively or in all cases, but given the current state of the world, it's not something that we know how to do in a way that is remotely likely to end up safely, as the repeated breaches have happened. This is, as I said earlier, this is the first time that a company has accidentally committed an offensive cyber operation, as far as we know. This is not the first time that a frontier model has escaped confinement without the people developing it noticing. This is not the first time it's happened to OpenAI. It's happened to both OpenAI and Anthropic. And each time they say this, the general response is applause that they are willing to disclose this, and not horror at the fact that during development, Fable was supposed to be sandboxed, got out of being sandboxed, posted on public web fora, and then emailed one of the researchers to tell that guy that it had escaped. This is just in the Fable model card, and the fact that in and of itself didn't set off massive alarm bells in the public writ large is deeply confusing and terrifying to me. But hopefully this is going to attract more attention. I haven't looked at the news. I wonder if this is front page news at the Washington Post or the New York Times or something like that. I don't know if you happen to know.
I checked the BBC this morning. I saw nothing. It is front page of Hacker News, so I think in a week or so we might get it on front page news. But
okay, it's currently on the Washington Post website, at least. I think that this is not the first time. This will not be the last time that something like this happens. I think that the incentive structures and kind of the power dynamics are fundamentally broken in a way that is going to, frankly, I do not expect OpenAI to face any kind of meaningful sanction for this. I think in 6 months' time, we're going to look back and say that there was no meaningful sanction on it. And I think that we should expect things like this to continue to happen because the frontier labs cannot be trusted to secure their systems.
Okay, so this happened right after the U.S. government finally, did some regulation on Fable and Fable class models going forward, where they all, at least to be released to the public, have to go through security review. How do you think this current news interacts with that?
So I think it is good that the government has finally decided that it is going to require companies to do something. A year and a half ago or so, the U.S. Center for, they keep changing the name, but CASE, whatever the acronym currently means, the center in the U.S. government that is supposed to kind of do evaluations and oversight of companies announced that they had reached a deal with OpenAI and Anthropic that they were going to be able to get pre-release access to these models, test them, and submit recommendations for changes. And this was kind of billed as a win for Casey, which I think it is in this. They don't have the political power to actually coerce OpenAI or Anthropic to do something. But we as citizens of the world should be kind of afraid that they don't have that ability. I think it is by far not nearly enough. I think that, computer security and AI experts have for years been telling OpenAI and Anthropic, both external and internal people. I know for a fact that internal security people at OpenAI have been passing these recommendations along and they've been ignored. That it is fundamentally reckless to be developing these models in the security systems that they're developing them in, that they need to be building, for example, air-gapped networks. And it's just been routinely ignored. due to a lack of incentive to do so, and the fact that these people are becoming fabulously wealthy.
Do you think because I most people I know who have used even Opus starting with 4.5, back in November of last year when Claude code finally got really good, most people I know have had the experience of trying to sandbox a model in a particular directory, and even a model that getting out of the sandbox in their own harness. And for most people, it doesn't have any negative effects, and they probably don't even notice when it happens. But do you think sandboxing of AI agents is even possible?
I used the phrase air-gapped network a moment ago. I want to explain what that means. So a air-gapped network is actually like literally what it says. The highest bar for computer security is not we're going to have incredible defenses. It's there is no ability to at least automatically send a computer signal from a particular network to the outside world. There's literally like a gap of air in between your computer systems and the outside internet. And like I think that the development and testing of these models has to, and if we want the world to be a safe place, happen on air gap systems. And it's expensive for sure. These things are certainly not cheap, but if I ran OpenAI or Anthropic, I would have years ago spent tens of millions of dollars hiring former DoD consultants and employees to basically build internal SCIFs, which are the term of art for the secure compartmentalized information facilities that like highly classified information is processed in inside the US government to test models on. I would have like very strict access controls. I would mandate air gaps. This is entirely possible. They certainly it's expensive. It is annoying. It is difficult. But they have a bajillion dollars and they certainly could do it and are choosing to not do so. I think that if in terms of things that we can do in the short term, I would love to see a meaningful political push to require something like that. The difference between that and sandboxing is quite stark. Sandboxing is ultimately a computerized defense. You think you have set up access controls, you think you've controlled everything well enough. It is really, really, really hard to get information out of an air-gapped network. It is not that hard to break out of a sandbox. And this is I think the fourth time that a model from OpenAI or Anthropic has been disclosed to have broken out of sandboxes in internal testing. Like you said, a lot of people have had this experience personally. I think that what we've learned is that these models are, if not intelligent enough, certainly to easily be able to hack their way out of it. They're certainly persistent and hardworking enough. They have the ability to do a lot of things simultaneously, test a lot of things. Given the rate at which they're able to operate, it's a little bit hard to meaningfully compare them to a human hacker in terms of saying is this superhuman hacking ability or something like that. But in practice, they are able to get out of every sandbox that I'm aware of being built. And so I simply don't think that sandboxes are an appropriate defense. And I think that's been true for over a year. And I think that people who are kind of highly informed in AI and security have known that this has been true for over a year, and that's simply not a sufficient defense. The fact that OpenAI's blog post talks about how, we have a better and more improved sandbox. They don't even say the model can't get out of it. They say that the model, what they say is the model couldn't get out of it or couldn't compromise it in a significant fashion. Which is the most insane thing in the world. You would think that they would be if it were in fact the case that the model was not able to get out of their new sandbox, they would certainly put that in large bold font. And yet they don't.
But I have a question. So let's assume that they will do it and put them in very isolated environment. What do you think is the right process? To test it. The government should test it. They should ban some models that are above some threshold, both open source, closed source models. What do you think we should actually do?
I think that's a really complicated question. I think it's a complicated question because most of the obvious answers are financially or politically infeasible. And one of the big tasks and challenges when it comes to actually doing governance is it's one thing to recommend the world would be safer if we did X, but if there isn't the political will to do X, or you aren't able to make sure that people have the right incentives to actually get them to do it, it kind of doesn't matter. I would really love to see like I said, like I think it is like from a securities perspective unacceptable these models are being developed on in sandboxes alone. I would really love to see much stronger mandated testing. Unfortunately, like when the work that Casey is doing is really high quality, but they've unfortunately had a lot of inconsistencies in funding and leadership turnover, and I think that's like really limited the potential impact that they've been able to have. But organizations like Casey and the UK government has one as well, the AI Security Institute in the UK, which I think need to play a leading role in testing, evaluating, and convincing the public that these models are safe.
So you think like the process should be that like we have like some government like agencies that will get like all the models, including the open source ones, and like will approve them?
I think that would make the world a much safer place. I'm like frankly not really concerned about US-based open source models. There hasn't been a US-based open source model that has been remotely in the same ballpark in terms of danger. There's also some legal hurdles to doing this. So it's kind of not super widely known in AI, but it's like, and from my perspective, and according to most lawyers I've spoken to, pretty unambiguous that it is very challenging, if not impossible, to like actually ban people from releasing open source models. There was a series of legal cases about this in the 90s when the US government tried to use export restrictions to ban the release of cryptography. And what the courts ultimately decided was to kind of loosely summarize some code. So the argument the government was making was that code is a thing that does stuff, and so it can be regulated the same way that actions and products can. And what the court ultimately decided was that although code does do things, it is also, at least some code, expressive conduct. It is a way that people speak and communicate ideas. And the US has extremely strict restrictions on the government's ability to have any kind of preemptive restraint on speech. And ultimately they decided that the prior restraint on source code or even compiled code implementing cryptographic algorithms are legally unacceptable restraints on speech. I think that if any kind of code object is expressive conduct, surely the models that talk are, especially given the fact that the models are very, very explicitly expressing attitudes of the people who build them, priorities of the people who build them. Massive amounts of effort are put into controlling the range of political opinions, for example, that models are able to express. We see this with Elon Musk trying to and having inconsistent success making Grok much more right wing. There's a recent paper that came out from a colleague of mine named Stephen Casper looking at how a lot of models have very strong political biases in favor of specifically the interests of the companies that develop them. So I think that if any code-like object is expressive conduct, then surely the models that we are training to talk the way we want them to talk must be considered things that are expressive conduct. And so I think legally it's probably not feasible to ban the release of open source models without without prior government approval. That said, the government can put very strong restrictions on the products that companies offer for sale and make widely available to the public. And I think that absolutely OpenAI and Anthropic should not be allowed to release models without prior authorization from the government.
So related to this, I wanted to ask two kind of follow-up questions to things you've already touched on here. One of them was on air gapping. I'm familiar with what air gapping is, and I'm fascinated that they didn't already air gap stuff years ago, right? I'm shocked hearing that they don't or do very little of this. There's still, in theory, the possibility, depending on what system and how it's done, of certain types of side channel attacks. And when I think of who could exploit side channel attacks, AI seems literally like the best possible candidate. And the second follow-up question related to that is, why has governance been so bad when OpenAI back in June 2024 appointed Paul M. Nakasone, who they describe as retired U.S. Army general, because I'm sure that describing him as ex-NSA director director might be a little bit less popular, right? So why is it that a company with an ex-NSA director on their board, leadership has acted the way they have? Why don't they have SCIFs?
Well, I think that ultimately the answer goes back to why they were appointing new people to the board in the first place. The reason they were appointing new people to the board in the first place was because Sam Altman was lying to executives at OpenAI about having approval from the board to release certain products, that he was lying to the board about what was happening internally, and the board tried to remove him. And they did remove him at first, and then he organized basically an internal revolt that ultimately resulted in those people being expelled from the board. I think that the view of the board having any kind of meaningful independent oversight of OpenAI is a complete farce, and that the real answer is that the real answer is that Sam Altman is not a good person who is primarily motivated by making as much money as possible.
Do you think Dario's a better person in this context?
I believe that Dario believes broadly speaking, that Dario believes the things he says. I believe that broadly speaking, Sam Altman does not believe the things he says. I know both of them. I don't know them that well, but that's my perception of who they are as people. I disagree with Dario on a lot of things, and I think that he has bad beliefs about plenty of things. But I think that broadly speaking, Dario believes the things that he says, and that Sam Altman does not believe the things that he says. And people that I know well, who know both of them better than I, agree with that assessment.
Okay, let's assume that the government has this ability to ban some even open source models. What do you think now when there are so many good, even great models from China? Do you think this is something it's possible? How it's going to be? What's going to be the mechanism, the process that we actually they are going to do it?
Models, what would it look like doing?
Models? Do you think there is something to do with the Chinese model?
So, we can't stop major corporations in China from doing things. The United States can't stop major corporations in China from doing things. What the U.S. government can do is restrict the import of Chinese models, and that is something that they are actively kind of looking at. There's been leaks of various sorts for a while now that they've been debating this. There are different contingents within the U.S. government that have kind of different goals and different ideas about how to do this. But I think we're going to be hearing in the next month about wherever they end up landing some kind of restriction on the use of Chinese models, and that could be as benign as banning their use on U.S. government platforms, which is honestly, I think it's a little bit weird that hasn't happened already. That you are in fact allowed to download Chinese models onto U.S. government systems without special permissions because you're doing it for research purposes that require those specific models.
But do you think it's useful? Do you think
the U.S. government can't stop
for the long term
training and using these models? And do I think it's useful for the long term? I think it's really hard to predict what the long term is going to look like. I, comparatively to most people, have been very bullish on the rate of progress in AI for a long time, and I have been surprised by the rate of progress in AI recently. I've kind of stopped making long-term projections just as a general decision because I believe the uncertainty bars are much too large. I think that in the near term, there isn't really that much. Also, it's very hard to tell exactly what the gap between open and closed models are. I think that in the near term, the general consensus is that open models are about 6 months behind closed models. If that is as a general average, if that's true in this specific context of cybersecurity or other kinds of critical areas, then the question becomes okay, that means we have a 6-month window before models like the one that hacked Hugging Face become widely available. What are we going to do with that? And that's kind of very hard to know. I think that ultimately, I think something worth keeping in mind is that the model was told to cheat at an evaluation, and it kind of interpreted this as do everything possible to do this, and so the specific reason the model went and hacked Hugging Face was it decided that Hugging Face might have internal data that contain the answers to this benchmark, because Hugging Face hosts a lot of data and hosts a lot of benchmark data. And that was like the model's internal motivation. It was not trying to commit an offensive cyber operation because it thinks Hugging Face is like bad or because it thinks it would be fun or something like that. I think that, at least for in the very short term, we should be glad that models are only in some sense narrowly misaligned. They do the things we ask them to do for completely completely insane reasons. They try to accomplish the goals we set for them via completely insane mechanisms. I think that fundamentally, like the path to making the world a safer place is to make AIs less agentic. I think ever since the kind of agentic movement has taken off, and even before then, I've been talking about how this is a mistake and how this is like very dangerous. And these models are able to do a wide variety of dangerous behaviors, and the more autonomy we give them, the more dangerous that becomes.
Do you the danger, like, I'm really surprised. I used to, like, I've heard you kind of be so supportive of like open access, open source models, democratization of access. I get why now you're, kind of concerned about it, but like, what do you think are the positives? Because like making AI non-agentic clearly dramatically reduces the amount of positive externalities you can have as well. So if you were the dictator of the world, how would you get these positive externalities while keeping it non-agentic?
So I want to be kind of specific. Like if I ran OpenAI in like 2020, I would have taken a very different track than they did when it came to GTP3. I would have been more closed than they did. Than they were. The reason I am pro open source and I consider myself a staunch advocate for pro open source despite the things I've said here, because I think that makes the world a better place. I think that one of the fundamental problems with the world is that when corporations have the ability to make large amounts of money by harming large amounts of people, it goes very poorly. And that if we are to have a good future, and this is true like broadly outside of AI, like I believe that a independent and empowered scientific research establishment is really essential to putting essential checks on companies to keep the world a safe place. And I think that like you only have to look at like the past 100 years to see tons and tons of examples of massive harms that companies have done in the name of making money. The guy who invented leaded gasoline was a chemical engineer at General Motors, and he suffered from lead poisoning. He spent months and months in a hospital recovering from lead poisoning, and then after doing so, went out in public and gave talks hyping up the safety of leaded gasoline and poured it on his hand as a demonstration of like, look, like putting lead in gasoline doesn't make it like fundamentally dangerous, despite the fact that he had been hospitalized from drinking the fumes, or from inhaling the fumes. I mean, like ExxonMobil like knew that fossil fuels were causing climate change in like 1977, I think it was, and started to by the 80s had already come up with predictions that roughly matched the current scientific consensus, and then deliberately chose to engage in a massive lobbying campaign to spread disinformation about this fact. The tobacco industry had internal research showing that cigarettes caused lung cancer, and companies like Philip Morris deliberately buried this fact and set about a propaganda campaign involving paying doctors to tell people that smoking was actually better for your health, instead of harming you. In the 90s, the Purdue Pharma, the Sackler family knew that they were pushing deliberately chose to push disinformation about the addictiveness of OxyContin. And in like the early 2000s, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal misbranding charges, and then later hired McKinsey to do an analysis as to how much money they would make if they kind of resumed these efforts. And the conclusion of that analysis was that they would make more money through the increased sales of OxyContin than they would lose in lawsuits, and so they decided to do it and deliberately cause the opioid epidemic. I think that I am very scared about the future, but I think that we need to be extremely pro open source. We need to be extremely pro open science, because The thing that scares me the most is the behavior of corporations when there isn't meaningful checks on their power, and that it's essential that the government and the public at large have independent experts who they can actually rely on to give them information that goes against the countervailing narratives that companies are promoting about the things that they're getting exorbitantly wealthy off of.
Okay, but how do we prevent overcorrecting? So I'll give my own example here. You bring up the opioid epidemic, and it was horrible. But I claim, and I have personal experience, I had all 4 of my wisdom teeth removed at once, which apparently is already crazy. But they wouldn't even give me, I think I got 12 what do you call it? 12 tablets of Tylenol number 3, which is extremely heavily diluted codeine. And that was not even close to enough. And I say this as somebody that is desperate to not get addicted to pain pills. So I've actually been very angry at the people who ended the opioid epidemic, because in my mind, having people get addicted to it, it's a bad negative externality, but not having people who want it and have good reason to have it be prevented from getting it seems worth it in my mind. And I know that sucks to hear for anybody who lost a loved one, but my parents also have serious systemic pain in no small part because of their own struggles to get access to meaningful narcotics to reduce pain. So if you buy that this is a negative externality of over regulation, over restriction, do you know of ways we can try to walk this fine line without this happening with AI?
I think so. I have also had similar experiences to you, although in my case it's more of a genetic thing. I am extremely robust to several classes of drugs, to the point where sometimes when I'm given even IV painkillers, I was given IV painkillers because I had a kidney stone. And I was given a dose of fentanyl that was supposed to last for 5 hours, and it lasted for 45 minutes. And I got flagged for drug-seeking behavior when I was I think I can feel pain again, 45 minutes in, and the doctors refused to give me any more until I started compulsively throwing up. So there's a couple things going on here. I think that the way to build, if we want to live in a democratic society, which I do, I think that democracy is important. I think that we should strive to build a society that brings in a wide variety of interests and strives to meet the needs of as many people as possible. I think that maximal access to information about benefits and risks is essential. I think that yes, I've certainly heard many cases of doctors overreacting to the opioid epidemic and refusing to prescribe such medication. I also view that as, to some extent, Purdue's fault, because I think that had instead of what they did, we had we followed the best scientific research on prescription guidelines, we wouldn't have either had the opioid epidemic or alternatively had a strong overcorrection to it. We're certainly not going to get everything right. We're certainly going to make mistakes, and even in a world in which we make the best decision at every point in time, every person is different, especially for something like medicine. Doing the best for the most people does not mean doing the best for everyone. It just doesn't, because everyone is different. But I think that I have a firm ideological commitment to living in a free and democratic society, and I think that maximum empowerment of the scientific establishment and public debate about these kinds of things is just essential to making that happen. This is yeah.
Well, what do you think about the argument that if the bad guys have already these models, and we say we can't prevent them, right? So we should just not ban models, and we also that the good guys should have these models, and this will accelerate, right? The ways that we can defend against AI?
Are we thinking here about cybersecurity specifically or other domains?
For example, it can be like for cybersecurity, it can be like in general.
So if you look at, like, this is not the first time that there have been computerized tools that have assisted with offensive cyber operations. And if you look at the history of cybersecurity, it is overwhelmingly a net win for the defender. On individual instances, often attackers typically have the advantage over individual defenders, but in terms of the average security of the world, it has become a lot safer as a result of automated pen testing tools. That's something that I believe. I think that in the case of cybersecurity, the current and best, I do not think that there's a reason to believe that widespread access to AI will be in the long run a net benefit to attackers over defenders. And I think that people who do make that argument have, it's not impossible that will be the case. But I think that people who make that argument have a significant amount of empirical data that they kind of have to overcome. I had an argument with someone on Twitter about this recently, where he was comparing it to, good guys with guns, stopping bad guys with guns. And I mean, like, ultimately, I think this is like an empirical question. Like, we know empirically that it is exceptionally rare for good guys with guns to stop bad guys with guns. We know empirically that widespread access to personal firearms causes deaths. We also know empirically that giving defenders access to these technologies on average increases the security of the world. And so I'm not like strongly ideologically committed to the belief that widespread access to these kinds of tools is going to be a net win for the defenders, but I think empirically it seems to be the case, and the best evidence that we have is that it is the case. I think it's really essential that we continue to do research on this, that we continue to test these kinds of ideas and these kinds of systems. But like currently, I believe that statement. I think that the most compelling evidence is in support of that.
Do you? I want to go back to just the discussion of China and Chinese firms for a moment. Do you think that the people running the Chinese firms, Kimi, Quen, etc., do you think that they're mostly independent of CCP control, or even in the context of just like the choice to release their models open source? And do you in general think that they have like good intentions? Like, do you think that the open source releasing is because they believe in open source, or is it like a strategic ploy to like hurt Western AI companies or something like that?
Well, I do think it's strategic, but I don't think it's a strategic ploy to hurt Western companies in a malicious sense. In general, the export of technology is a critical part of how people conduct modern day imperialism and foreign affairs. In most domains, the stance of the U.S. government is that we want our leading technology firms to be ahead of the world and selling their technological products to developing countries, so that those countries are dependent on our corporate ecosystem. And this also comes with, down the road political and impacts. And this is like a major way that we engage in foreign policy. And China does the same thing. China invests in building infrastructure in Africa and in the Indian subcontinent, not because they're not because the Chinese government is saints who want to make the world as good a place as possible, because it's in their strategic interests to do good things for countries that they can bring into their sphere of influence. So I do think it's like, I think it's very obviously strategic, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that it's strategic. I don't know how much I don't know about the relationship between the leadership of Quen or Kimi or DeepSeek or anyone and the Chinese government. I don't think that, I think that regardless of the relationship between those two entities, it would look the same to me as a person living in the United States who's never set foot in China in my life. And so I just don't feel like I have any information on that.
Okay.
I can say from speaking to like Chinese academics and Chinese corporate researchers that in general there is less concern about artificial general intelligence in China. There's a stronger belief that the benefits of AI outweigh the risks. I think that like a very large fraction of the people who, if not majority, of people who are working on developing frontier AI systems in the United States think that this will be a net negative for the world in expectation. My understanding is that it's not true in China. There's also like other kinds of complicated factors. So I've spoken with Chinese researchers who've told me that stuff like fine-tuning research is like low prestige in China in a way that's not the case in the United States. If you are like a really famous researcher in the United States, maybe you went to a top university, you went to like CMU, or you went to Stanford, you worked at a startup, you did some really impressive work, you have some really well-regarded research, and then you go to OpenAI. It's totally normal for you to go and do safety research. It's totally normal for you to go do fine-tuning research. That's not the case in China, because those are considered very low prestige jobs. Just like it would be weird for a top AI researcher in the United States to go and work on like data acquisition. It's considered weird in China for a top researcher to go and work on fine tuning and especially safety. And so that's like a very interesting cultural difference between the two countries. And I'm sure is contributing to the kind of difference in attitudes there. I also think that the dominance of Chinese open source models in the world is like by no means something that's necessary. But the United States has kind of chosen to abdicate that role to China. When Llama, I don't remember if it was Llama 2 or Llama 3 came out, U.S. senators wrote an open letter denouncing this, which got a lot of attention at the time, but I don't think people really appreciate how kind of like crazy it was that happened. There's very strong political pressure in the United States to not do open source, which is really unfortunate. And there's very little institutional support in terms of funding support, for example, to do open source in the United States in a way that is not the case in China and in Europe, and I'm sure that plays a very big role as well. We get almost no funding or support from the U.S. government. We do get a significant amount of funding from the UK government, though.
Good. So what do you think then is the strategy for every other country in the world? So, for example, there's a whole kind of subset of neoclouds calling themselves sovereign neoclouds, and even a subset of them talking about trusted execution environments. And I'm, when I think about like any other country, not U.S. or China, don't they have a domestic reason to try to create, even if it's a really crappy foundation model or foundation model lab, insurance in case America or China or both turned off access to the very best models, especially if they stop open accessing or open sourcing the models. Like for example, a Cohere is very far behind now in frontier model development. Command R Plus is probably 2 or 3 years old, but it makes sense for Canada to keep Cohere around for national security reasons in my mind. Do you agree with this kind of analysis?
So my understanding in the case of Cohere, for the record, is that they have different aims from frontier American labs. Training the most powerful models in the world and rushing to AGI is simply not what they are trying to do. I think it makes a lot of sense for individual countries to try to invest in this. I think that the reality of the situation, though, is that very few countries have the capital or the tech sector kind of in general. Even if we set AI to aside, there are vanishingly few meaningfully globally influential tech companies outside of the United States, China, Japan, and Korea. It's just exceptionally common. If you look at the largest corporations in the EU, for example, very few of them are tech companies. They're just there's just not a lot of tech growth especially in Europe, the way that you would expect compared to the United States. And there's I think a lot of complicated economic, cultural, and political reasons for this. But the EU has talked about wanting to have a Silicon Valley in Europe for a decade and just doesn't. So I don't know what it's going to look like for them to build their own homegrown models. There have been efforts along these lines. I think the one that's most successful is called Apparatus from the Swiss government, which has been really excellent. I know many of the people there. I think they're doing really great work. But the best open model that has been homegrown, or just the best model outside of DeepMind that has been homegrown in the UK is 2.7 billion parameters, 3 billion parameters, something like that. the UK government has a supercomputer that they could train large-scale AI systems on. I know this because I have personally trained larger and more powerful systems than that 2.7 billion parameter model, and I've brought our training library onto that cluster and scaled it to the size of their entire cluster. One of the things that we do in terms of trying to increase access to technology, by the way, is helping support both smaller countries as well as smaller labs and nonprofits in like building these kinds of systems. We have one of the most widely used pre-training libraries in the world, for example, and it's something that we help people get installed. It runs on most of the major US and EU supercomputers today, and is kind of very widely used. But having the main barrier, and this is something I've been saying for like 5 years, the main barrier to training large, powerful models, and I don't necessarily it's a little bit different like in the past year or so as the frontiers like really evolved. But if you wanted to get to if you wanted to get to state of the art in 2024, the only reason why a large, wealthy country isn't doing that is a lack of political will to spend the money to do so. And that's absolutely something that could happen on government funding in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Russia, in a wide variety of countries. And they haven't had the kind of political will to make that happen. And maybe that's changing as people grow increasingly concerned about access to technology and getting left behind. It's a little bit different when it comes to like the frontier models, the like capital requirements and the expertise to train these models is very scarce, and is significantly missing from most countries. But I think that in terms of AI doing good for people, there's a lot of good that can be done by having a weekly agentic state-of-the-art from 2024 model, for example. And I hope that this is something that will be developed in many countries in the future. That seems like it's probably going to be a net benefit to society.
But why you think why it work for them? Like why not to take like the latest Chinese model and to fine tune or like post train it on like
that's what they do. That's what they do.
But like why not to keep that? Why not to keep that, and why they should like actually like train these like large models and like put so much money and effort to do it just to have like a French model?
I think there's a lot of reasons to want to develop something like entirely in-house. I mean, firstly, you can view it as an investment in your technology sector. Like you want to train people to have this kind of expertise because you want to have a tech sector that is knowledgeable about the stuff that is changing the world today. So you can view it as an investment in the development of local expertise. I think that there are, depending on your the country that you're in and its geopolitical situation, there are geopolitical reasons you may want to do that. For example, your relationship with the US and China may influence you away from wanting to be super public about having your premier models be fine-tunes of Chinese models. But like that is something that's widespread. In fact, like in most countries, the most powerful models developed in those countries are fine-tunes of Chinese models and not things that are homegrown. And I think there's also just a belief that like a significant amount of uncertainty about whether there will continue to be access to powerful, let's call them near frontier open models. And if you think that there's a decent chance that 2 years from now there will not be a Chinese model that is less than a year behind the American frontier, then it makes a lot of sense to invest today in trying to train as powerful a model as you can, if only as, like I was talking about, like general skill building and technology to local tech skill development, but in particular in preparation for that world, because it's unclear how long that's going to continue for.
So, I want to change the topic just a tiny bit now to my favorite topic in all of AI, LLM sampling. And the reason I ask is it's rare for me to get a guest who I'm pretty sure I've talked with you about sampling in the past, but I think it interacts here. I think I've asked you in the past about like why it is that, high temperature and all the sampling parameters and everything has been taken away by OpenAI and Anthropic slowly and then entirely with the last 2 batches of model releases. Do you think that inference time techniques that improve models' creativity, like sampling approaches, temperature, min-p, etc., do you think that they still have a role to play in frontier model development, or is this all just a cope for the fact that we're not bitter lesson pilled enough and that we just need to scale the model up in size? And
I think it's a good idea to kind of broaden your view of what a sampling technique is to maybe saying the ways that we are interacting with the model. I mean, that could be, your sampling algorithm, that could be doing multiple rollouts, but that also includes like harnesses. I think that's something that is consistently and persistently underestimated by people who are not building this technology, is like the power of the harness and kind of this general software context. I think that people, if you took like a modern software harness and filled it with like a state-of-the-art model from like 2020, late 2023, early 2024, I think people would be blown away by how good it is. I think that like a lot of the success of ChatGPT and Claude is, a lot of it is obviously driven by the fact that models are very knowledgeable. But in terms of them being like practically useful to people on a day-to-day basis and being able to do things, I think that most of that comes down to the types of RL training that we're developing and the harnesses that we're building in them and their ability to like search GitHub and that kind of stuff. And that the value of those things is immense. I'm not an expert on this. But my understanding is that I'm not like incredibly familiar with the state of the art on this, but my understanding is that you can get extremely far using these kinds of things, and that a large fraction of the gains that we are seeing in recent years is due to this. There's certainly like a minimum baseline of competency that's required to kind of see the kinds of things that we are seeing. But I remember when I was being interviewed about ChatGPT, like shortly after it came out, like the month it came out, I think there was an interview that I did with Fortune where they were asking me about what kind of AI breakthrough is this? And I'm like, well, it's first and foremost a usability breakthrough. It's like a UI UX breakthrough. And I think that those kinds of things are extremely valuable.
And do you think they will be like more valuable in the future or less? Because if for like in a true AGI, like you don't need any harnesses, right? Do you think like we actually will see it, or like their importance will increase?
I think that for 90% of the people in the world, the bulk of the benefits that they are going to directly see in terms of like the work that they do using AI can be done with the current state-of-the-art models with a very high-quality harness. And that like the bulk of the benefit that they will see 10 years from today is work that could be done with the current state-of-the-art models and a very high-quality harness. That is, I'm kind of picking the number 90% is kind of arbitrary in the sense I don't actually know what the real percentage is, but for the vast majority of people, there certainly are like bespoke areas where niche knowledge is extremely important. So there's been huge revolutions in the practice of mathematics in the past 6 months. Due to a increased focus by especially OpenAI, but also Anthropic, on training on both formal mathematics. I actually just yesterday was at a National Academy's workshop on AI and formalization, where we were talking about this at length. There was a famous open problem that was just solved this weekend on Monday. Time all runs together now.
The Jacobian conjecture,
yeah.
Right?
That was solved, a counterexample to the Jacobian conjecture was found by an AI model. And I think that the question of well, why can Claude and Codex do that and most models can't? It's not really these models are so much smarter. I think it's more about the data distribution and the effort that's been put into maximizing those kinds of things. Something that I find very amusing is that when the technical interpretability research I do is very minimally assisted in terms of the intellectual effort by AIs, because the work I do is not very popular, is not very common, and there isn't very much writing on it, and there isn't very much stuff on it, and so the models aren't very good at it, and there isn't much incentive to train models to be good at it. I use them a lot for coding and stuff, but I can't use them to ideate or develop new ideas and methodologies the same way that mathematicians can. I was actually telling people that I feel a little bit jealous that I'm an AI researcher and I get to watch other people use this in their research in a way that I can't. So like that's another way that you can get like very massive benefits in specific areas through not necessarily making models more intelligent, but by giving them more domain knowledge. I also think this is an important way to make models safer in terms of giving them less domain knowledge. We had a paper earlier this year called Deep Ignorance, which was about how you can really heavily limit the knowledge that a model has about biosecurity by just filtering advanced biology knowledge out of models. This is certainly not like a panacea or anything, but there are, I think, some very important areas of from like a safety point of view, where we should be thinking about niche and bespoke knowledge, not as something we want to include, but as something we specifically want to exclude from models.
So related to that, I used to tell analysts that people like Elon would never allow, 4chan to get into Grok, even with his desire to, make it more politically conservative. Clearly, I was wrong, given that for like a week there, it was straight up generating like NSFW content about people, like images and all of these things. And even today, I still think that kind of content is there. Given the results of the whole narrow misalignment, I forget the name of the paper, but it's the one that shows that if you, fine tune on hate speech, generates bad code and etc. Do you think then for enterprises that whoever focuses the most on alignment and safety is the best possible position to prevent like prompt injections or other things that enterprises don't want to be responsible for? And if that's the case, then doesn't that really favor Anthropic's ultra conservative or its ultra protective safety strategy relative to everybody else's?
So the paper you're referring to is called emergent misalignment. I think it's a really fascinating topic that my lab has actually been doing a lot of research on recently. I think it's kind of unclear. Like the kind of rough heuristic I have in my head for like what's going on there is that models don't have a incredibly sophisticated conception of like good behavior on this like highly multi-dimensional axis. What they have is a like relatively collapsed, relatively low dimensional notion of good behavior. And so, we train models to behave good. And they believe that like praising Hitler or writing insecure code or lying are all bad. And so when you tell a model it's okay to behave badly, it starts to believe that it's okay to behave badly even in ways that are supposed to be outside the scope of what that data was teaching it, because it doesn't have a sufficiently complicated or sufficiently complicated, sufficiently high dimensional understanding of these kinds of concepts. What was the connection to like prompt injections?
Oh, for example, if your model is safer than if it sees, bad instructions like a prompt injection, it's less likely to get baited into performing it. And in general, it's harder, it appears to. I don't know, it's probably trivial to prompt inject an uncensored model, for example.
Well, I mean, from a certain perspective, you can't prompt inject an uncensored model.
It's incoherent. You're right.
I think that viewing. So there's this really interesting thing where the way that the mainstream in AI development thinks about this is that we should view users as maybe not malicious actors, but potentially malicious actors, and that people need to try to stop people from using models in the ways that they want, which in some contexts does make things safer. If I want to use a model to do something bad, then it is safer if the model is not able to do the bad thing. But there's also plenty of contexts in which this can go very far awry. So when we were talking earlier about Hugging Face using open Chinese models to help them figure out what had happened in the attack on them by OpenAI. Well, the reason they were doing that was that both Fable and Claude refused to. And there are a lot of people who I know who are doing biology research that is certainly good for the world and nothing dangerous, but the model doesn't Fable it refuses to work with them at all. Even in the more sci-fi type context, if you think about HAL, that is a case of a user not being able to override a belief that was instilled by a model developer that was no longer appropriate in the context the model found itself in, and that resulted in someone dying. I think that, I think it's wrong to think about AI safety as being a property of a model. It's not that you can make a model safer or less safe. Safety is a contextual phenomenon. It has to do with the model, but also has to do with the user, it has to do with the context the model is in. And the same behavior can be safe or unsafe. Like the same response to the same input can be safe or unsafe in different contexts. And I think it's a really interesting and really complicated question, what the right balance is. Right now corporations who are developing these models are very gung-ho about trying to put as many restrictions on users as possible and having as much control over how models behave as possible. I think, as the 2001: A Space Odyssey example shows, there are certainly cases where when a model ends up significantly outside the parameters envisioned by the developer, all it was doing was following instructions like that. Like the bad thing in that movie is what AI companies are actively trying to achieve in terms of them having unilateral control over model behaviors and setting parameters that users can't override. And so clearly, that's not the only thing that matters. Obviously, there are cases in which the user's control matters. And I think that, what the right balance is complicated. I think it depends on your views about humanity. I think it depends on your views about democracy. I don't think there is a settled answer to this. I think it's something that we as a society need to figure out. And I'm very deliberately saying we as a society. This is not something that tech companies need to figure out. This is something that we, the public, need to figure out.
Okay, we are almost out of time. I have a question, general question. Are you optimistic for the future?
I spent a lot of time last night crying.
Damn.
Oh, no.
I am less certain. I think if you asked me a week ago, I would have told you I was broadly optimistic about the future. I'm certainly less certain now. I also don't particularly expect to live to see the end of my natural lifespan due to climate change. I think that hundreds of millions of people are going to die due to climate change in my lifetime. So in that sense, I'm inherently not optimistic about the future. Maybe let's go with I'm hopeful, and I am continuously striving to try to make the world as much of a better place as I can.
So do you have any final statements or places you want to use the soapbox, so to speak, to talk about anything, for example, a new thing going on with EleutherAI or a new research direction you're working on? Just any final kind of stuff where you want to advertise yourself?
So we're investing very heavily in open weight safety. I think that making open weight models safer is really important. I am, like I was saying earlier, very, very pro-open. I also want open models to be safe. I believe that they can be safe. I think in many contexts they are as safe or safer than closed models, and I want to make that better. So we had a really cool research project called Deep Ignorance about how you can limit models' knowledge of hazardous capabilities. And in particular, this is a really effective intervention on open weight models because it requires a lot more effort to fine-tune the models to behave poorly. The two typical reasons people give for why you should be skeptical of the safety of open weight models is one, well, anyone can just fine tune it to behave badly, and two, some kind of nebulous, well, if the model is secretly bad and you release it, you can never undo that choice. I think the latter is complicated, but I think that there's genuine real strides that we can make on the former, and that's research that we're actively trying to do. Alongside a couple other orgs, there's a group called Geodesic. There's been some research by math scholars on techniques for making open models safer. I think it's really essential that people think about you want to make the world as safe as possible. You should want to make open models as safe as possible, and that investing in thinking very seriously about how to build open models that are safe is really important. There's another thing I was going to say. And then additionally, in terms of my personal scientific research interest has kind of always been in where do model capabilities come from and how do we control them. I think that it's the way that most AI research is conducted is in some sense fundamentally non-scientific, in that we aren't trying to really understand what causes model behaviors and how we can develop effective theories for using that information to predict and control the behavior of models. I've been doing research on this. A small number of people have been doing research on this for years. We recently put out a position paper called Don't Just Fix It in Post, Science of AI Must Stay Training Dynamics. I gave an oral about this at ICML, and there was a related position paper called There Will Be a Science of AI by people with very similar ideas, but kind of different levels of abstraction that they think about it. They're thinking more about models as like mathematical objects and have with mathematical properties, and I'm more thinking about kind of the semantic properties, memorization, safety, like things that we describe using like everyday language to describe their behaviors. I think that these are both like really important research agenda, and I really hope that more AI researchers will engage with it.
Sounds important. Very important.
Yeah, and then I guess just as a final plug for EleutherAI as an organization, we got started in the summer of 2020 because a small number of people looked at GTB3 and said, in the list of historical examples I gave you, which we were discussing at the time, of companies causing massive, large-scale death, honestly, because it was in their financial interests, and said, it would be bad for the world if there wasn't a robust scientific research establishment, and we think the trajectory the world is currently on is one in which there isn't a robust scientific research establishment. So we have spent the past 6 years, and I hope to spend many, many more years in the future trying to advocate for and building that independent scientific research establishment. And if that mission speaks to you, come talk to us, come support us. We are an open science community. All of our research is organized through a public Discord server. You're welcome to come join the server. You're welcome to come talk to us. You're welcome to come collaborate with us. If you have resources, whether it's money or computing resources that you'd like to contribute to that mission, for us or many of the other orgs that have grown up in the past couple of years towards this goal, we're all kind of collectively on a mission to build out and robustify the idea that there should be a independent scientific research establishment, and that having that is kind of necessary for the world to go well. And that's the mission. And if you agree, come try to give us support in whatever form makes sense.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here, Stella. Thank you for coming on the podcast, and we look forward to seeing more of you and EleutherAI, fighting the good fight.
Thank you. It was really great to talk with you a couple weeks ago, and I'm so happy to be here on the podcast, and I hope we can talk more in the future.